Growing up, Thanksgiving was my favorite holiday. It always meant a table overflowing with food, laughing family members, and the warm scent of pumpkin pie wafting through the air. However, this year was different. My family had grown distant, caught up in life's responsibilities, jobs, and whatever else life threw our way. I was living in a cramped studio apartment, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. So when my sister texted a week before the holiday to say she'd be hosting Thanksgiving, I was filled with a mix of joy and dread. I immediately assumed I'd at least bring dessert or contribute in some way, but when I asked her whether I should pick up a pie, she responded with a strange silence that pinched at my gut. Finally, she texted back, "It's fine, just come," leaving me in a pit of uncertainty. As Thanksgiving approached, I tried my best to prepare mentally. I envisioned my family around the table, laughing over stories from past Thanksgivings, feeling full and happy as I enjoyed their company. Then, I wondered if I could really afford to pitch in this year. I didn't want to seem cheap, but the thought of struggling to make rent mixed with the guilt of not being able to contribute gnawed at me. The evening of Thanksgiving dawned crisp and clear, and I arrived at my sister's house, trying to remember what it felt like for everyone to get together. As I walked through the door, a delicious aroma hit me. The turkey, roasted to perfection, mingled with the sweetness of cranberry sauce and buttery rolls. For a heartbeat, everything felt perfect, and then I noticed something strange. My sister had a pinched smile plastered on her face, and the guests, a mixture of my siblings and their partners, seemed uncharacteristically tense, the clinking of forks muffling the chatter that should have filled the room. I tried to shake off my unease and joined in, eager to dig into the feast. But soon enough, after a few awkward exchanges, my sister announced that a sudden rise in grocery prices this year meant that everyone would need to contribute, which was a strange proclamation considering how we'd always shared the burden as a family. It felt like someone had ripped the joy out of the room. Why did it feel like such a dire situation? I looked around, searching for supportive eyes or someone to break the tension. The shallow laughs only underscored the simmering discontent in my heart. Just as I started to relax, she passed around a collection bowl, glaring at me as if the responsibility to pay for Thanksgiving groceries rested solely on my shoulders. My mind raced, confusion clouding my thoughts. It isn't a potluck if you intend to charge your family to attend. The ambivalence unfolded further as she demanded we each pay an outrageous amount akin to what a meal would cost for a dozen people at a restaurant. I looked at my family's expectant faces. I felt trapped. My heart sank because I would have defended my point without hesitation had this not been my blood. So, I hesitated, caught between the horror of being labeled the cheap sibling and the truth of my situation that left me worrying about bills. Just as I opened my mouth to voice my feelings, a small voice from my youngest niece chimed in, asking why we couldn't all share the joy of spending time together instead of worrying about money. My heart squeezed painfully. I saw my sister's face go pale. I tried to shift the conversation, laughing nervously and sharing a silly story about being trapped in my cramped apartment, but it only felt like digging a deeper hole as my other siblings stared at me in disappointment. I could feel the energy of the room crashing and swirling around me. My pulse quickened, panic began to choke the air. I voiced a quiet AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. Trying to gauge the atmosphere. Unexpectedly, that innocent prompt lit up tension. "Well, maybe if we all pitched in like we used to, we wouldn't have this problem," my sister snapped, her smile long gone, replaced by a deep flush of anger. Before I could speak, the room erupted into a cacophony of arguments, voices tangled in a familial riot, accusations of selfishness, indifference, and entitlement scraping against each other like metal on metal. I recoiled, panic clawing its way up my throat as I desperately tried to understand how my innocent gesture had thrown everyone into chaos. I could have sworn I watched our family fracture in real time, the crushing realization that we had begun to care more about our pride than the warmth of our shared history drowning the last shreds of joy in the room. My niece started crying, and suddenly the world blurred around me. It felt like I was in a nightmare where nothing could be salvaged. I don't know how long I sat quietly afterwards as their voices echoed, part of me desperately wanting to bolt from that house, and yet another part wished to mend the fraying bonds of my family. I took a breath, willing to attempt a peace offering, only to have my sister shout that it wasn't about me, it was about the costs, almost as if she were trying to erase my existence from that evening. I watched as one sibling left in anger, the door slamming shut behind them, a hollow thud that lingered in the air and resonated deep within me. I can't recall how we finally settled down to the meal after that storm. Tension had wrapped itself around the uneaten turkey, the sides untouched, and we grappled through half-hearted cheers, the festive spirit sucked dry. After a painful pause, I left to the bathroom, desperately trying to breathe, and when I looked in the mirror, all I saw were the guilt-laden eyes of the niece I had disappointed, an image that would haunt me long past that evening. I stepped back into the dining room, shifting on my feet, feeling like I had stumbled into a family gathering less than ideal, a space that felt less like home than an echo of what we used to be. The atmosphere stank of resentment. As I murmured a quiet goodbye later, guilt churned, reminding me of people I loved, staring at their half-eaten plates riddled with an anguish that would linger, ready to haunt me as the holidays loomed closer. My expectations, rather than bringing me into the fold, had created a rift that would deepen and darken into every Thanksgiving to follow. All that remained was the question, AITA for expecting not to have to pay for Thanksgiving groceries. And in the end, the answer was unfathomably clear: it costs more than money to keep a family together. I work at a low-key diner in a small town, the kind of place that serves grease-drenched fries and all-day breakfast, where regulars come to sip overly sweetened coffee and swap gossip that echoes off the chipped linoleum. It was a job that I took out of necessity more than passion, especially since my mom had just recently fallen sick, and I had all the bills piling up at home. My coworker, Karen, is the kind of person who thrives on petty drama. She's got a knack for turning mundane requests into full-blown crises. She's also been eyeing my Wednesday morning shift, my only early day, like a hawk, but I'd made plans to take my mom to her bi-weekly therapy session, a rare opportunity for us to reconnect, as my work schedule often monopolized my life. It was during one of her endless complaints about her own commitments that she launched into a full-on crusade, convinced that I, the selfish employee, was sabotaging her chances for success. I politely declined when she first asked to swap shifts, citing my prior obligation, but that only seemed to snowball into her relentless barrage of guilt trips and passive-aggressive remarks. "You don't care about anyone but yourself," she huffed one night during closing, flicking the fryer switch off with far too much force. "Some people have real ambitions." I tried to shake off her words, but they clung to me like sweat-soaked uniforms. I thought maybe I was being unreasonable, and since people love to insist that kindness is a two-way street, I made the mistake of texting her one evening to see if we could reach some understanding, joking that I could trade my early shift for her Saturday night, which is the busiest time at the diner, hoping this would make her think twice. But Karen was relentless. She acted like I'd committed treason. Soon I was receiving messages from other co-workers, who were also under her spell, asking me why I couldn't just be a team player, to do it for the family of the diner. It started to feel like a witch hunt, but I stood firm. I couldn't lose my one chance to spend quality time with my mom. The weight of my decision hit harder one night when I overheard Karen talking in the break room, plotting ways to undermine my credibility. She painted me as the villain to anyone who'd listen, saying I was sabotaging her dreams while simultaneously tearing down my work ethic like I was the problem ruining her life. I couldn't comprehend how a simple shift swap had turned into something so twisted. Was I really the antagonist here? A part of me thought about just giving in, but the memory of my mom's face during our last appointment reminded me of what I was fighting for. A tiny but fierce part of me didn't want to grant Karen the satisfaction of having made me yield. As weeks dragged on, I noticed strange things happening. Orders would come in for tables I wasn't assigned, the ice machine would mysteriously malfunction, and patrons oohed over the burnt toast that I'd swore I never cooked. It got to a point where I almost felt like I was being bullied at my own job, a chilling sensation creeping over me that Karen had somehow turned the rest of the staff against me. One particularly chaotic Saturday, I was hit with the nausea-inducing news from my boss that I would need to take a 2-week indefinite leave due to additional training. It was a thinly veiled excuse, but I heard the laughter in Karen's eyes when I left the break room. With my heart racing, I pulled up the diner's group chat later that night, only to see Karen had shared a meme about a greedy coworker that looked suspiciously like me. The blind rage surged within me because I was sick of her games, but it wasn't until the night of my mom's treatment that everything spun out of control. Sitting in the waiting room, I suddenly received a frantic text from my coworker Sarah, warning me that Karen had taken my shift, and I knew she'd done it just to make a point. Panic gripped me, an icy hand squeezing my insides as I reflected on how low she would sink just to win a petty fight. I rushed back to the diner, yelling at the owner, but he was too mesmerized by Karen's shining performance behind the counter. I left, heartbroken and nauseated, feeling trapped in a web of everyone else's delusions. But it was that anger that eventually propelled me forward. I swore I would no longer allow anyone to dictate how I conducted my life. So with a heavy heart, I made a plan. I kept my mom's treatment notes clutched to my chest, carefully documenting every absurdity about the diner and getting to know my coworkers better. The next time I stepped in that diner, I was armed not just with memories, but intent and vengeance. It was no longer about the shift, it had morphed into a catalyst to take down a toxic work environment once and for all. As the weeks passed, I slowly began gathering support, showing my colleagues the truth behind Karen's facade, and it wasn't long before the memes and whispers flipped on her. The tides turned swiftly. She was out of the restaurant and back to being the messy, bitter person she had always been, while I finally reclaimed my time with my mom. I may have felt guilt at first for refusing to give in, but sometimes putting yourself first is the only way to stop a bigger issue. It was the hardest battle I had gone through yet, but I emerged victorious, with lessons learned, with scars that whispered reminders that no matter how vitriolic the world becomes, integrity always matters more. After all, being a team player doesn't mean losing yourself in someone else's game. I am writing this because if I don't, the memory will consume me. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and for almost half my life, I've harbored a secret that has haunted me since childhood, a secret that recently spilled out and shattered my younger brother's perception of his most cherished memory. 14 years ago, we spent an idyllic summer at our family's lake cabin, where the highlight was a photo of my 6-year-old brother, Daniel, catching his first fish. In that moment, he beamed with an ear-to-ear grin, the sun reflecting off the lake's surface, framing him in what seemed like pure magic. But the truth? That photo was a lie. I'd photoshopped the image to replace a snapshot of him in tears, furious at not being able to haul in the fish I'd caught earlier. I did it to preserve not just his childhood pride but my own. I wanted to be the perfect big sister, the one who always made things better. For years, I let him believe he was a fishing prodigy, a glorious little angler destined for greatness, and I felt like I was doing right by him. However, guilt festered in me, a festering wound pretending to be a scar, and as life would have it, I plotted my confession, trying to plan it in the least destructive way. Yet, the worst time came a few nights ago when Daniel, now a confident 20-year-old with dreams of being a marine biologist, wanted to use that photograph for a presentation on childhood memories. That's when the truth slipped from my mouth like a dark shadow breaking free, the realization that my brother's most treasured moment was nothing more than a fabrication. I watched the joy in his eyes fade until they were eclipsed by confusion and betrayal. I initially thought admitting it meant I'd cleanse my conscience, but it only unleashed a raging storm in him, a tempest of hurt and anger that left him reeling. I thought he'd laugh it off, surely he wouldn't hold it against me. But as I witnessed disbelief morphing slowly into hurt, it dawned on me that I had stripped him of a part of his innocence, weaponized what was supposed to be a simple memory, turning it into a cruel joke that twisted his childhood in ways I never anticipated. "Why would you do that?" he demanded, his voice barely cracking but laced with a boiling fury that felt alien yet terrifyingly real. "It was my moment. You took that from me, and for what? A stupid story?" The pain in his voice cut deeper than any blade, and I crumbled. I never expected to feel this insignificance take root in me, as if I had turned back time and was faced with an immense weight of responsibility. I tried to explain my motives, how I thought I was protecting him, yet my words felt hollow against the backdrop of his devastated expression. That night, he walked out, leaving me alone in that cabin, its walls suddenly closing in on me, each of our shared memories mocking me with their cheerful nostalgia while I was engulfed in darkness. I spent the following hours replays in my mind. What if I'd told him earlier? What if I'd let him have those painful moments? I kept him safe, but I kept him small, shrunk him into this tiny box of falsehoods, and now he wouldn't speak to me. I tossed and turned until dawn, visions of my brother's face swirling, the hurt, confusion, and disgust straining and pulling within me. As I watched the first light of morning creep through the curtains, I made a decision. I needed to do more than just apologize. I needed to show him the truth behind the photo, the real memories, the harshness of life that accompanied growing up. That's when I turned to the internet, diving into every forum, every advice column I could find on how to mend the rifts in family dynamics, how to deal with guilt when it's intertwined with love. It was then that I stumbled onto something strange, a post titled "Twisted Memories, What Would You Do?" The comments flooded my vision, ranging from empathy to outright hostility. It was as if the world had taken their collective traumas and laid them bare for the sake of my enlightenment. Each tale was unique yet framed by a common theme, the struggle of truth versus illusion. Among them, a single comment stood out, a user claiming to have once erased a sibling's memory too. She wrote of a photograph that had twisted a sibling's childhood with dark magic. At first, it seemed absurd, but the more I read, the more I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The user shared that after years of sharing fabricated stories, the guilt manifested as something more sinister. She claimed that reality had warped around her lie, that she began to see glimpses of future memories that became nightmares, shadows that crawled into existence, feeding off the deception. As I read the comment, my heart started to race. I didn't want to spiral, but how could I ignore the uncanny parallels to my life? I decided that if Daniel wouldn't come back to me, I needed to find my own path through the chaos of guilt. I returned to the cabin, armed with the intent to face this truth head-on, and there I felt the weight of those walls close in on me once again, my own memories whispering doubts and fears. I pulled out my phone, wanting to salvage what remained of our bond, and scrolled through old pictures, each swipe sending jolts of nostalgia through me, reminding me of the little boy who had looked up to me for everything. When I stumbled upon the photo in question, there it was, the fake image that haunts me now, the one that ripped away Daniel's childhood dream like a thief in the night. But instead of just darkness, a flicker of something else caught my attention. In one corner of the picture, hidden in the shadows, a figure stood barely visible, unusually distorted, as if it were a reflection of something highly malevolent, its fingers stretched, reaching toward Daniel, the fish eerily vibrant yet dead in his innocent grasp. My heart raced. The comment I had dismissed now felt like a warning. I was about to delete the image, when the memory of that summer clamped down harder than ever. The shadows of our childhood somehow now felt as if they'd been alive all along. The fish, once a token of triumph, now felt like a whisper of something sinister, a memory turned into a potential nightmare, a cycle I had started. Suddenly, the cabin ambience shifted, it felt oppressive, and the air thickened with unshakable dread as I glanced towards the window where a chill breeze swept through, chilling the hair on my arms. There, lurking in the shadows where I'd once seen joy, I perceived movement, just a flicker, but enough to send a cold tremor up my spine. I raced outside, desperate to make sense of what I cropped out all those years ago, hoping to recover the essence of that moment and shield my brother from the darkness that might have crept within our lives through my deceit. What if, in the echoes of my defense, I had unleashed something more sinister, something festering all those years, waiting for the right moment to strike? I took a deep breath as I faced the lake, where sunlight danced innocently across the surface, but the memory of that photo lingered like a stain. I vowed to Daniel that I would rectify this mistake. It wouldn't matter how awful the truth was, it needed to be told. As I plunged into the water, each stroke burned with purpose, with the resolve to collect remnants of the past, to confront whatever shadows had twisted our truth. It took 2 agonizing hours, the sun slipping down the horizon by the time I emerged victorious. I held a rusted fishing lure in my grasp, the very one I recalled tossing in frustration during that summer. As everything fell into place in my mind, I felt a chill run through me, not at the lure but at how dark and twisted my path had become. When I finally returned to shore, I felt different, lighter, yet the shadows lingered, as if darkness intertwined with my essence. As I faced the cabin, knowing I had to confront Daniel, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stir, almost mocking me. But I made my way back to the cabin, with each step weighted by that rusty lure, hoping with every part of me to reconcile this burden of childhood illusions before it engulfed us both. And there I found him on the porch, lost in thought, vulnerable, shattered, and staring aimlessly at the fading light. "Daniel," I started, but the tremble in my voice echoed doubts that swirled in the still air. Would my truth be enough? Would it even matter? I hugged the lure to my chest, and as darkness fell around us, I took another step, knowing I still had my own damning shadows to face, a tale woven together by our secrets. I always thought that family gatherings were supposed to be joyful, filled with laughter and love, but for me, they were a reminder of the hollow ache in my heart, a wound that never seemed to heal. I had been married for 3 years, and despite countless doctor's appointments, hormones, and shattered hopes, I still hadn't been able to give my husband what his family craved, a grandchild. It's not that I didn't share their dream. I wanted a child as much as he did, but an insidious cloud of infertility hung over my head like a guillotine, waiting to drop at any moment. At every family dinner, the conversation would inevitably spiral toward the kids my sister-in-law was expecting or the cute stories of my husband's childhood that I had heard 1,000 times, both of which sent a fresh wave of salt water stinging my eyes that I would fight to keep at bay. As the chatter became more pronounced, I noticed the unmistakable glances my mother-in-law would cast my way, the pitying concern pooled in her eyes like the still water of a stagnant pond. I could feel her discomfort, her insistent attempts to engage me in discussions about fertility treatments under the guise of concern and support. I hated it. I hated the unwelcome attention on my most vulnerable secret, the nagging whispers that echoed through my mind. I wasn't just a woman, but a broken cog in her family's wheel. It all came to a head last Thanksgiving, the air thick with expectation as the aroma of roasted turkey drifted into my nostrils like a false promise. After we had feasted, my in-laws gathered in the living room, eyes glistening under the faded twinkle lights, chatting animatedly about future family plans. My heart raced as I sensed the shift in focus toward me, the moment when my mother-in-law cleared her throat, the precursor to her infamous "let's talk about the future" speech. "So, when do you think we might meet our grandchild?" she pried, her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor of underlying desperation. It was as if every pair of eyes turned to me with that question, the words swirling in the air like vultures, scavenging the carcass of my dreams. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and wanted to sink into the floor, to evaporate, but instead, with a jagged breath, I simply remained silent. My husband shot me a concerned glance, his father deflected with an awkward chuckle, but the damage was done. I felt raw, exposed, and utterly furious. Why should I have to discuss my deepest pain with people who only saw me as a vessel? That evening, as tension simmered beneath the surface, I retreated to the bathroom, clutching the cool porcelain sink, my heart racing as I battled the swirling storm of emotions. The shadows seemed to whisper, urging me to confront my in-laws about the delicate matter, to reveal the truth that felt more sacramental than flesh and blood. But all I could recall was a memory, the time I had briefly shared my struggles with close friends only to hear their casual insensitivity. "You can always adopt," was an unsolicited suggestion that had dug in like nails on a chalkboard. How could I trust anyone with this? Instead of expressing my frustrations, I turned my phone off and avoided them for the rest of the evening, feigning late-night work calls and bathroom breaks to escape their probing questions. When I returned to the living room, the chatter had shifted to other topics: my sister-in-law's baby shower planning, the grand plans summer would bring, all accompanied by the laughter and affection I had once thought unbreakable. I sat back down, feeling smaller than ever as my in-laws and husband conversed with ease, laughter cascading over me like a heavy wool blanket. I couldn't help but think that I had become a ghost in my own life, floating through moments that once filled me with joy but now only reminded me of the family I was struggling to provide. In the days that followed, our house grew quiet, almost painfully so. My husband, kind and patient, tried to forge conversations around my feelings, but all I felt was a wall robbing me of my voice. I became a coward, staring down the never-ending silence whenever my in-laws called or texted. Their messages turned from curious to frustrating, filled with concern that made my skin crawl. A week later, the family WhatsApp group ignited with photographs of my sister-in-law's ultrasound, and a tear slipped down my cheek as I muted the notification, each ping a dagger twisting into my heart. I felt like the villain of my own story, the one who refused to talk about the very thing that drained life from me. In my mind, I played a relentless cycle of what ifs. What if I talk to them? What if I shatter their dreams? What if I shatter my own? I could feel the weight of family traditions and expectations pressing down on me like I was being submerged underwater, gasping for breath and desperate for release. As the cold chill of winter set in, I avoided attending holiday celebrations, ducking out of every gathering, and insisting on working through the long weekends, all while my heart sank deeper into despair. Then came the shocking twist. One late night, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled upon a group dedicated to fertility issues, and suddenly, there it was, a thread that ripped the bandage off the wound I had tried to shield from the world. A woman, vulnerable and raw, told of her struggles and gave voice to the very pain I feared, and I felt it resonate within me like a forgotten song. As the comments poured in, each a testament to the shared struggle, it felt like a glimmer of hope. Until she casually mentioned, "Just remember to communicate with your loved ones, they can't help you if they don't know." Her words clung to the walls of my mind, pressing against the restraints I had put in place. That night, I finally broke down, tears flowing freely as I thought of my husband, the love we shared, and the family I had allowed to slip farther away. The next day, I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and initiated a text to my in-laws asking them to meet me for coffee. I had finally decided, it was time to talk. The moment my mother-in-law walked into the cafe, I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, only to be overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay beneath. We chatted about benign topics for a while, but the air was thick with unspoken words. As the steam from our drinks rose like ephemeral ghosts, I finally opened my mouth, feeling the weight of every word crash down around us like waves against the shore. I spoke of my struggles, the heartache, and the silence that had become my wall. They listened in silence, and in those moments, when the truth laid bare between us, I felt the temperature drop, an awkward pause settling like dust after a storm. To my surprise, after a few beats of silence, my mother-in-law reached across the table, her hand clutching mine, offering more than just sympathy, it was the promise of understanding. I finally began to heal, slowly but surely, yet the path wasn't easy. Some days, I faltered, the weight of expectation still looming over me, but I knew that mothering would come in many forms, perhaps not the expected route, but one that was uniquely mine. As time progressed, I became part of those family conversations, advocating for my own journey to expand our family, while embracing the unexpected joys that awaited us, understanding that familial love is resilient and can be found even in the spaces of discomfort and raw honesty. Sharing my story didn't only help my in-laws understand the pain I carried, it liberated me from its grip, transforming the way we could interact with one another. I wouldn't be the perfect daughter-in-law or the perfect mother, but I would be something far richer, an authentic member of a family that, in its messy, imperfect beauty, could truly embrace one another for who we are. Even after all the pain, I found myself craving those family gatherings, looking forward to laughter, to the inevitable questions, but also knowing that this time, I'd be able to talk about the dreams that had once felt so out of reach. So, AITA for refusing to talk to my in-laws? No, I realized, I was just human, and sometimes it takes a little courage to find the voice that lays dormant within. I still remember the night I found myself sitting in the dimly lit corner of that upscale restaurant, the air thick with the scent of rich herbs and roasted meats, a place that had been a favorite haunt for my wife and me since our early days of marriage. It was a peaceful evening, the clinking of silverware and hushed murmurs wrapping around us like a soft blanket, until I noticed him, a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, sitting 2 tables down, engaged in an animated conversation with his friends, his laughter piercing through the serenity like a jackhammer. After a couple of minutes, my frustration began to bubble as he leaned back in his chair, balancing precariously on the rear legs, treating the fine dining experience like a raucous college party. I exchanged glances with my wife, who was trying to enjoy her crème brûlée, but the escalating volume of the young man's voice was unbearable. He leaned back further, tilting the chair back grotesquely, and for a split second, I could swear he was trying to show off, perhaps reliving some frat party glory days in this place that felt far too classy for such antics. It was one thing to laugh and share a good time, but this felt disrespectful, a blatant disregard for the ambience meticulously crafted by the staff. I wouldn't have intervened if it weren't for that moment when he stood up, raising his arms above his head in what could only be described as a triumphant pose, as if celebrating the success of a prank, and I snapped. Without thinking, I leaned forward, my voice firm yet calm. "Could you sit down, please?" The sudden tension wrapped around us like a noose, his laughter fading and curiosity sparked in the eyes of other diners who glanced in our direction. The young man turned to me, a mixture of surprise and disdain washing over his features, and for a moment, I thought he might explode with that youthful arrogance that comes so easily in that age. Instead, he slowly lowered his arms and sank back into his chair, a pout forming as if I had stolen his spotlight. After a few seconds of incredulous silence, his friends erupted in laughter, mockery spilling out in waves, making the atmosphere thicker still. I could feel my ears burning with embarrassment, but I held my ground, silently staring back, until the waiter approached, an unsure smile on his face, and asked if everything was all right. My wife cleared her throat and gave me a look that screamed why. I smiled awkwardly, as if I were somehow the villain in this scene, but I justified my actions. Etiquette must be respected, right? I glanced back at the group and noticed something unsettling. The young man's eyes no longer met mine, but fixated on something behind me. I turned to look, half expecting to see an imposing figure, but there was just a shadow, a flicker of something, a person perhaps, but I shrugged it off as mere paranoia, the tension in the room seeming almost palpable. The young man, now quiet, seemed to sink into the moment, returning to his typical demeanor, but I noticed the flickers in his eyes were growing more ravenous, more unstable. I thought I had controlled the situation, but something felt off, the way he kept glancing around the restaurant now, not in embarrassment or irritation but with a strange, almost fearful curiosity. When he finally stood again, it was not for another triumphant show-off but rather a nervous fidget, and that's when the place grew quiet again, all eyes glued to him, waiting, and that included mine. He stepped away from the table, his friends still oblivious as they flirted with their cocktails, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was drawn to the far corner of the restaurant, as if he sensed something lurking in the shadows. I leaned in toward my wife, whispering that something was strange, that I didn't like this, but she rolled her eyes, insisting I let it go. I couldn't. I watched him approach the window, the lights creating a halo around his head as if illuminating his path to whatever was pulling him toward that darkness outside. Suddenly, he leaned closer to the glass, peering out as if he were staring into another realm, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Just then, the lights flickered, casting the room into a brief panic of shadows, and I swear I saw something flash across his face, fear, excitement, then despair all at once. He backed away as if he had seen something that struck dread, his breath quickening, and I couldn't help but think maybe I had crossed a line by speaking up. The restaurant's hum resumed, the wait staff doing their best to maintain a charade of normalcy, but I couldn't shake that pulsing feeling growing in my gut, eerie and foreboding, as if some ancient curse had awoken from a long slumber. Everything was wrong now, from the decor to the polished silverware. The laughter felt hollow, as though a specter had begun to swirl amongst us, lingering on the edge of our consciousness. When he gradually approached his table again, now visibly on edge, something inside me braced for impact. Would he explode? Would he retaliate against my outburst? Instead, in a soft yet firm voice, he muttered something to his friends, and one of them laughed, unaware of how close to breaking he really was. With each second, I felt the weight of dread crawl closer as his laughter turned into an awkward silence, punctuated only by the creaking of wood beneath chairs and the clinking of glasses. In that moment, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of guilt, a gut-wrenching realization. I had triggered this young man's descent into madness with a simple command to sit down, and as the clock ticked, I felt myself pulled deeper into a spiral of dread and regret, trapped in a moment that spiraled out of control until finally the shadows closed in on us all, and I wondered if I had just unleashed something dark, if perhaps it was I, the one ironically sitting down, who had finally surrendered to the sinister undercurrents of the world, forever marked by the terror of simply trying to enforce a semblance of civility. I wasn't the kind of guy who went around crushing the dreams of 7-year-olds, but something about my girlfriend's brother, Timmy, always rubbed me the wrong way. Maybe it was the way he puffed out his chest as if he were a king while wearing his oversized superhero pajamas, or the fact that he made me play against him in video games every single time I came over because he was convinced he could beat me if I just dared to try. I used to let him win. Sure, I'd play a little harder than normal, but I figured it built his confidence. Timmy was a sweet kid otherwise, always the first to offer me a cookie from his stash or show me his favorite toy, but there was something almost sinister beneath the surface of that small, innocent face. It was his relentless whining every time I beat him, the way he would stomp his foot and demand I go again, claiming I was cheating as if I were some kind of adult monster trying to ruin his childhood. I tried to laugh it off. I didn't want to diminish a kid's spirit, but when he kept taunting me about how I was never going to beat him at anything ever, I felt that familiar itch to prove a point. It was a calm Saturday evening when I finally snapped. My girlfriend was baking cookies in the other room, and the sweet, chocolatey smell wafted through the air, mixing with Timmy's cries of frustration as I scored yet another winning point. "You just let me win, didn't you?" he accused, glaring at me with those huge, innocent brown eyes that suddenly didn't seem so innocent, as if the shadows of the dimly lit room were casting a spell that twisted his features into something darker. I took a deep breath, my heart racing as something primal ignited in me, a sudden desire not just to win, but to utterly destroy his confidence right then and there. "No, Timmy, this time it's for real," I said, feeling a surge of energy course through my veins. I wouldn't just let him win, I would crush him, mercilessly. As we picked up the controllers with renewed intensity, I focused my eyes on the screen, which seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, the colors flashing brighter as I dove deeper into the game. I performed moves I didn't even know I had inside me, deftly dodging every attack and countering every strategy he tried to pull. With each round I won, I expected Timmy to laugh or challenge me more fiercely, but the glow of the TV reflected in his gaze as he stared in stunned silence at the pixels that represented his rapidly fading hope. I felt exhilarated, but as his face fell, I also felt a strange chill creeping up my spine. It was as if the house around us was growing colder, the walls whispering tales of the arrogance of pride and the dark side of competition. I'm not letting you win again, Timmy. This is just how it is, and you need to understand that. The words tasted bitter on my tongue as I said them, and for a moment, guilt washed over me like a cold wave crashing onto the shore of a lonely beach, but I pushed it aside and focused on the screen. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I turned the game into a dominating disaster for him. I perfected the final move, and just as I hit the game's concluding action, the room was engulfed in darkness. The TV flickered and died, plunging us into an eerie silence, the only sound being the added stream of my own heavy breathing, and I felt every ounce of joy drain from the atmosphere as Timmy sat there trembling, his small hands clenched into fists that shook like leaves caught in a violent storm. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice a whisper as though he was terrified of the answer. I started to reply, but that was when I noticed the lights in the house flickering strangely, almost rhythmically, as if trying to communicate in a language only the children of nightmares could understand. The shadows lengthened, extending across the walls like spectral fingers grasping for something they shouldn't have, and in that moment, I realized that the darkness had not merely consumed the television but had troubled the very foundation of our reality. Timmy's laughter turned into a wheeze as he backed away from me, terror dancing in his features, and I don't know what compelled me from that point on, but I instinctively moved toward him, wanting to make him feel safe, wanting him to understand that I was still in control. When my hand brushed against his shoulder, the air turned heavy, the atmosphere thick with something sinister, something that had been lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for just this moment to reveal itself. I thought I heard whispers, distant and haunting, echoing within my mind, and they sounded alarmingly like Timmy's voice as he gasped and said, "I just wanted to win." And I couldn't help but laugh, a short, nervous chuckle that caught deep in my throat, because it suddenly became clear that this was about more than just winning a game. This had become a matter of life and death. Then he ran. Timmy bolted for the door, screaming his lungs out, but the house felt like it closed in around me, the walls twisting and folding until I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Shadows crawled along the floor like spiders, wrapping their clammy fingers around my ankles as I stumbled forward, trying to follow him, but it was as if the house didn't want me to leave. Then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped, the lights flickered back on, illuminating the room in a blinding flash, and there stood Timmy, wide-eyed, as if he had just caught a glimpse of something unspeakably horrifying. Blood drained from my face as dread settled in my stomach. Whatever demon had stirred inside that game was now writhing between us, an unspoken accusation hanging in the air. "Are you mad?" he stammered as fear carved lines into his innocent face, and just when I thought I'd backed myself into a corner from which I could never escape, I heard it, an echo of laughter, warped and malevolent, that seemed to seep from the very walls, shaking them with sinister intent. That's when I knew, I had irrevocably broken something inside Timmy, something precious and innocent, and whatever darkness had awakened in that moment was now straining to escape. In that split second, I realized that I wasn't just facing the consequences of my cruel decision, I had unleashed something terrifying, a cruel shadow cast by my own hubris. A cold shiver snaked its way down my spine, as I whispered to Timmy, "I didn't mean for this to happen," but the words felt hollow and the room echoed back with an unsettling refrain, timid yet filled with a knowing horror. We stared into the face of an inexplicable fear, one that bore no physical form yet demanded to be reckoned with, and as I stood there paralyzed, I could almost feel the world fracturing beneath my feet. Those few seconds stretched long and thin, moments filled with understanding that some lines should never be crossed. I knew I needed to do something, to make amends while I could still grasp reality, but just then, Timmy's laughter resumed, only this time it sounded like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot, a boy's giggle turned cruel, echoing from the shadows that had seeped into the corners of the room. I was caught in a web of my own making, shackled by consequences, trapped in a darkness that bore witness to my mistakes, and I was left wondering if I had indeed become the monster in the children's tale I'd once considered so innocent, the very arbiter of nightmares unleashed upon this world in an unthinking act of pride. I never thought that a simple no could spiral my life into a relentless nightmare, but then again, I think we often underestimate how quickly the human mind can twist itself into the shape of malice. It all started when my neighbor, who I had always considered friendly, knocked on my door one chilly autumn afternoon. He was desperate, explaining that he had family visiting and no parking space available, pleading for just one day's use of my extra spot, something I had meticulously preserved since my brother had passed. I felt guilty, even as I formed my words, recalling that it wasn't my responsibility to accommodate him. "I'm sorry, but I really need that spot," I said firmly. He blinked, disappointment flashing across his face, and for a split second, I worried I had crossed some invisible line. "Okay, suit yourself," he replied, his voice slipping into that unsettling calmness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. That evening, I settled into my usual routine, but the air in my apartment felt thick and stifling, as if the walls themselves were eavesdropping. The next day, I noticed my neighbor's car parked in front of my driveway, blocking my entrance. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but now it felt like a direct challenge. I stepped outside, greeted by a swollen sense of dread. "Could you move your car?" I called out, forcing a smile that felt feeble. His response sent chills racing along my spine. "Not my fault your spot is empty, is it?" From then on, it felt like a war, each day adding fuel to the fires of resentment. He called in false complaints about my late-night music. Neighborhood Watch was informed that I had too many guests parked out front, and it wasn't long before I realized he made it clear to others that I was a nightmare neighbor. The whispers slithered through the streets like an unwelcome fog, suffocating every connection I'd formed in the block. Isolation wrapped around me, a warm but suffocating blanket. I went to my car one moonlit evening only to find it scratched, deep gashes carved across the pristine paint. I stood there, heart racing, and it hit me that this was no coincidence. When I confronted him, he merely laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that haunted me even in my dreams. It wasn't long before every friendly face in the neighborhood turned away, lost somewhere in the disarray of rumors and twisted truths. I decided to take a different route and began documenting everything, each incident meticulously noted in a notebook, the complaints, the damage, the ominous notes slipped under my door. It felt sensible at first, like a lifeline thrown into a pool of chaos, but as the pages turned, the act felt increasingly paranoid and desperate. One night, racked with anxiety, I curled up on my couch with a few glasses of wine, hoping the alcohol would dull the sharp edges of fear. While grappling with insomnia, I decided to check my doorbell camera, both for shreds of sanity and evidence. I just wanted to run through the footage of the night I had scratched paint. To my horror, I discovered something I could never have anticipated: my neighbor standing outside, wearing a thick black hoodie, his face obscured beneath the darkness of a winter night. He loomed by my car, pouring some clear liquid onto the trunk. It shimmered like a bright star when it caught the light. I panicked, realizing I had forgotten to lock my door. Shoving past the beers and the remnants of junk food, defense mechanisms against the chilling apprehension now boiling my blood, I ran to the door, my heart pounding a thunderous rhythm. I flung it open, but he was gone, leaving behind an echo of laughter that felt like ice spilling through my veins. The next day, I filed a police report, but the officer, a weary middle-aged man with coffee stains on his uniform, seemed more amused than concerned. "Just a neighbor dispute, ma'am, nothing serious," he chuckled, dismissing my escalating paranoia while I insisted through gritted teeth that his actions had crossed an unsafe line. Days turned into weeks, but the situation escalated. One morning, I woke to find my entire car was covered in eggs, some smashed and gunky, the others still intact like rotten grenades. I could no longer discern the difference between reality and a waking nightmare. Was it even possible for someone to be that vindictive? A dark reflection of my own thoughts bubbled up, suggesting maybe this monsoon of chaos wouldn't end until I retaliated, until I dove as deep into this nightmarish rabbit hole as he had. But just as I found a tiny ember of resolve within, unease cloaked me as I spied him staring at me one lonely afternoon, a wide grin plastered across his face. It twisted something inside me. Perhaps this was all a game to him. I sought answers, diving into deeper roots. I tracked whispers of past neighbors who had endured their own terror at his hands, piecing together a fractured narrative that revealed a history soaked in acrimony. Each encounter morphed into dread, the shadows thickening with lies. The sense of friendship had crystallized into something sinister. My final attempt to reclaim my space felt extravagant, even foolish. I tossed out everything I had documented and staged a confrontation I knew bordered on insanity. The night felt thick with foreboding as I cornered him outside, demanding he leave me alone, but he merely laughed again, that infuriating, deep sound that wrapped around my consciousness like a vice. "Why don't you focus on managing your own space instead of wasting time at my door?" His words rolled over me like a cold wave. In that moment, I recognized the absurdity of trying to fight someone so twisted, so bent. I stepped back, something inside me fracturing as I muttered, "You'll regret this," my voice small, an echo of fading confidence. And just as I turned to leave, I heard what felt like the closing act of a narrative gone awry, my heart halting when he called out to me one last time, "You already have." I drove that evening, not to work or friends, but to the edge of sanity, piecing together the tangled web of fear and loathing that had bared itself in my life. It took time, but in those shockingly still moments, clarity descended upon me. I understood my only option to end this sick game was to move away permanently, to cleanse myself of the taint of his shadowy presence. As I packed, every belonging stripped away from the condo felt like an entanglement burnt from me. I left that apartment a shell of who I was, yet had it ever truly been mine? I shrugged off the weight of his existence like a snake distilling its skin. But as I drove toward the next chapter in my life, with a bittersweet taste, I vowed to never forget the lesson learned. In neighborhoods where darkness breeds, kindness is a fickle facade, and sometimes refusing to let others in comes with a heavy price. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece at the last minute would lead to the nightmare that I am now living in. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday night. I had been looking forward to a solo evening binge watching my favorite shows, just curled up in my blanket with a bowl of popcorn, when my sister called. She was in a panicked frenzy because her plans with friends had fallen through at the last minute and she needed someone, anyone, to watch her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. I hesitated, knowing full well that Lily's recent behaviors had made me uncomfortable. In the past few months, she'd been acting strangely, saying odd, almost unsettling things, like how she saw shadows move in the corners of her room or how her dolls would talk to her about things she couldn't possibly have known. I always shrugged it off as childhood imagination or just an overactive mind, but something in my gut twisted at the thought of being alone with her for several hours. "I can't," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "I have plans." The voice on the other end didn't take it well. My sister began to plead, insisting that I was being selfish, but I stood my ground. "It's just one night," I thought as I hung up, relieved until I glanced out the window and saw a shadow pass by my front door. It felt ridiculous, I told myself. It was just the wind or some stray cat, maybe even my imagination running wild, but then I heard a light tapping at the glass. I brushed it off as the tree branches swaying in the evening breeze, or maybe just my overactive mind playing tricks on me, until the tapping became a steady knock. My heart raced as I cautiously peeked through the peephole, and for a split second, I saw a small figure standing there, swaying slightly under the porch light. Instinctively, I swung open the door to confront whatever was there, only to see nothing. Just an empty porch, the night air wrapped around me like a heavy cloak. Dismissing everything as some childish prank or a figment of my imagination, I locked the door, shaking my head at my foolishness. I turned back to the TV, trying to immerse myself in the glow of the screen, but kept feeling that sense of dread resting at the back of my mind. As I settled back into the sofa, I convinced myself it was just nerves from the confrontation with my sister. But the unease lingered. I could feel it pressing against my chest, suffocating me as the night dragged on. I decided to distract myself with a few episodes before bed, but just as I'd settled in, my phone buzzed. It was my sister, text after text flooding in. "Please, I'm desperate. Lily's acting strange. I need help. Where are you?" My stomach twisted as I read her frantic messages. I was about to reply when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of giggles, soft and high-pitched, floating from somewhere outside my window. My heart thumped painfully against my rib cage, and I stood up, moving closer to the window to peer out into the darkness. Nothing, just shadows pooling at the foot of the trees in my yard. But then my eyes caught a flash of something pale, and I noticed it wasn't just shadows dancing in the wind. It was Lily, standing at the edge of my lawn, her hair tangled over her face, her little hands clutching her doll, which seemed impossibly larger than her. Panic erupted in my chest as I realized she'd somehow gotten here despite my refusal. I rushed to the door, flinging it open to call out to her, but my voice caught in my throat when I saw her face. She was smiling, and it was wrong, too wide, contorted in a way that felt inhuman, and her eyes glinted in the dark like they were lit from within. "Auntie," she shouted, her voice echoing eerily, sounding less like a child and more like an echo of something dark. "Come play with us." "Us?" I stammered, my stomach churning, but before I could process what was happening, she tilted her head, and the darkness around her seemed to shudder, hundreds of little whispers threading through the air like icy fingers. I realized with gut-wrenching certainty that she wasn't alone. I'd read stories about evil things hiding in the guise of children. I stepped back instinctively, heart racing, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were vacant, swirling like storm clouds. "Don't be scared, Andy. I've brought my friends," she purred, the shadows behind her deepening and looming closer. Panic coursed through my veins, and I slammed the door, retreating to the safety of my home, my mind spinning with the horror of what I had seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a child's folly, a trick of the light, but the knocking started again, more insistent this time. It wasn't a steady knock, though. It felt like fingers, hundreds, scratching at the door, their whispers creeping through the cracks. I fumbled for my phone, contemplating calling my sister, but what would I say? Her daughter was out there with friends? I needed to think. The second I gathered myself to move toward the kitchen for some water, the lights flickered ominously, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat before they returned. That was when I heard the unmistakable sound of giggling again, now layered with whispers, words tumbling into one another that sent my heart racing. I had to open the door, reassure Lily somehow, tell her it was all okay, but when I cautiously opened it again, instead of the small child, I was met by a hollow laugh that sent ice through my bones. The porch was empty, yet there was a chill in the air that spoke of menace, something lurking just beyond the light. "Auntie, come out and play," echoed through the night, and my instincts screamed for me to retreat. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest as I shut the door, bolting it securely and retreating further into my home, but I could still feel those eyes, those countless eyes watching through the dark, just waiting. I stumbled through the hallway to find a weapon, anything that could offer me a sense of security, when I noticed something on the floor. A small shadow lay near my feet, casting an impossible silhouette on the wall. It was Lily's doll, the one she always carried, its glassy eyes glittering even in the dim light. I recoiled in horror as the whispers intensified, now clearer and rising to a frenzy. "She's not yours anymore. We want her home. Come out, come out." They wrapped around my thoughts, making me feel warm, comfortable, even as dread clawed at my throat. I couldn't let them have her. Suddenly, the lamps flickered, casting chaotic shadows across the room, bringing to life dark silhouettes that danced on the walls. Just when I thought the chaos had reached its peak, a chorus of giggles rang out, echoing all around me. I knew I had to act before it was too late. Rushing to the back door, I grabbed my jacket and flung it on, preparing to face whatever awaited in the dark. But the sounds grew louder, almost jubilant, a cacophony of twisted mirth that echoed through the hall. I gripped the handle and swung the door open, ready to confront whatever shadowy monstrosity awaited, but all I found was the glassy-eyed doll sitting on my step, its pale face turned towards me, grinning, with Lily's giggles chiming in the air. "You can't escape us, Auntie. We're already home." That's when I knew I had made the wrong decision. I choked on my breath, realizing that in refusing to watch my niece, I had invited terror into my life, and the very shadows I thought I'd escaped were now closing in, the whispers wrapping around me, claiming me for their own. The moment I stepped into my classroom that dreary Thursday morning, I could feel a heaviness in the air, a tension coiling like a serpent about to strike, and as the morning sun struggled to filter through the grimy windows, my heart sank when I noticed a sea of students excitedly whispering in the corners, their eyes darting towards Sophia, a bright-eyed, hopeful 15-year-old with an infectious smile that often lit up the room. She had been dreaming of her quinceañera for years, a celebration of her transition into womanhood, and as her teacher, I could see the crescendo of her hopes building with each passing day, especially as she summoned the courage to approach me after class, a breathless determination etched across her face as she asked if I would help her plan it. My instincts screamed at me that something was amiss. Rumors whispered through the halls, hints of troubles at home that not even I, the well-meaning teacher, could unravel fully, but I nodded, a slight encouragement at the corners of my mouth. I agreed to help with the decorations and even promised I'd talk to the administration about allowing her to use the school gym for the event. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the excitement around her quince spiraled into something resembling fairy tale hype among the students, I couldn't shake the growing unease that shadowed my heart, fueled by encounters I had with her family's financial struggles. When Sophia, glowing and radiant, approached me the following week to finalize some of the plans, I hesitated, the weight of uncertainty clutching at my throat, and when I muttered that I wasn't sure if she could have the quince due to potential issues stemming from her family background, the air thickened, her smile faltered, the color drained from her cheeks like someone had pulled the plug on her dream. A stunned silence fell over the classroom, the other students leaning in, wide-eyed, and I tried to clarify myself, to retract my words, but the damage was done. She turned on her heel and fled, leaving behind an echo of disbelief. From that moment on, I felt a shift. The whispers grew louder, not just amongst the students, but I could feel the chastising stares of the faculty, their judgment as corrosive as acid, speculating if I crushed a girl's aspirations with a careless comment. Days slipped by in a haze of regret, Sophia avoiding my gaze, her laughter replaced with a sorrowful hush, and just when I thought I might make amends, I was hit with an email from the school's principal informing me that Sophia's family had withdrawn her from school, effective immediately. Panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to reach out, to apologize, to let her know I never meant to upset her, but the digital void was deafening, a complete stop to all communication, and I was left to wonder if my offhanded comment had spiraled into something far darker than I could comprehend, until one night, after tossing and turning under blankets of regret, I received a chilling email from Sophia herself. The subject line read simply, "You were right," and as I opened it, I felt ice peel back the layers of my guilt. The email revealed that her home life had grown increasingly chaotic, her family struggling with unseen demons, her father losing his job, the celebratory dresses replaced with hunger pangs, and buried within the paragraphs was something that made my heart lurch. She wrote of a plan to reclaim her narrative, to find hope amidst the shadows that threatened to consume her entire existence, and as I read her words, the line blurred between despair and resolve, making me question my own role, my own cruel insensitivity, for I realized too late that my uncertainty had not only cast a cloud over her quinceañera but had transformed into something far more sinister. It had unwittingly exposed a fracture that ran deeper, something I never grasped until it was too late. The email concluded with just a single question: is there really a chance for me? The sorrow woven through her words struck me, coursed through my veins like a wildfire, igniting a desperation to reach out and guide her, but when I tried, my emails bounced back. Her family had severed all ties, pulling her from the world that had become too oppressive, too unforgiving, and it struck me like an axe splintering wood. My hope for her future had become twisted with every moment I'd let my doubts fester and grow, leaving me with a shrouded understanding in the silence that followed her departure. The echoes of laughter that once filled my classroom were replaced by an eerie stillness, and as I sat, the burden of guilt settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat, I couldn't help but wonder if I had not only become a stranger in her life but a ghost in my own, a cautionary tale of how a thoughtless remark, even in the name of caution, could chip away at the dreams of someone so young, trapped in the shadows of their own despair. All because I had been too afraid to believe in the chances that flickered like a distant candle, extinguished by my own doubts. I didn't know the trouble I was stirring when I casually mentioned the inappropriate comment made by my brother-in-law, so let me start from the beginning. I'll never forget the night we sat in my sister's living room, the warmth of the fireplace filling the space as laughter echoed between us. My boyfriend, James, was making some joke that transformed into a hesitant silence when my Bill walked in, his eyes shifting too quickly away from me. It was a regular family gathering until he leaned towards me, mouth curling into a smirk, and whispered something that sent chills down my spine. "You know, I can make you feel better than your boyfriend ever could." I laughed it off as a crude joke, but deep down, the weight of those words anchored in my chest like a stone. I didn't tell anyone, didn't want to ruin the night, and with a glass of wine in hand, I pretended like it never happened, but that smirk lingered in my mind, a ghost that would haunt me into sleepless nights. Days turned into weeks, and I could feel the tensions rising around the dinner table. My sister noticed that something was off, that I was quieter than usual, and James seemed to pick up on it too, his confusion morphing into concern. One evening, we found ourselves alone on the couch, the softness of the moment washing over me, and it spiraled out before I could catch my breath. I confessed to James what my Bill had said, thinking it would make him angry and protective, but instead, his face drained of color, a mix of disbelief and something more profound flickering in his eyes. "You should tell your sister," he said, and I imagined the tumult it could create. Was I overreacting? I didn't want to be that person who caused drama, who stirred the pot, but the thought of seeing my Bill again, of pretending everything was normal while I carried that secret, felt unbearable. So, after a restless night plagued with guilt, I took a leap. I found my sister in the kitchen, her back turned to me, music softly playing, and I told her the truth, my voice trembling, heart racing, waiting for that inevitable fallout. The recognition that sparked in her eyes was worse than I expected. She crossed her arms, her body rigid, and demanded I didn't play games, that I was out of line for trying to ruin their relationship over something so trivial. My stomach dropped, the betrayal slashed deep, and still, I pressed on, but it felt as though I was drowning in her disbelief. "He would never say that," she yelled, disbelief spilling out like venom, and before I could piece together a defense, my Bill stepped in from the hallway, his smug demeanor reeking of knowing something I didn't. In that moment, I felt trapped. I was the villain for sharing a secret, while he was framed as the innocent bystander, charming, disarming with that smile that had once felt welcoming, now twisted and sinister. More drama erupted like a storm, as James finally snapped, defending me with veracity, calling out my sister's blindness and my Bill's insidious nature. It felt like watching the world unravel, colors bleeding into chaos, accusations flying, and amidst it all, I stood there a fragile vessel of truth as my sister's heart shattered against the reality of her husband's hidden face. Suddenly, the tension escalated, voices booming off the walls, and in the commotion, my Bill attempted to save face, masking his discomfort with arrogance, backpedaling, and making excuses, but every denial fell flat around us, and the room felt as though it was crumbling, like we were standing on shaky ground. The aftermath of that confrontation shattered everything I knew. My sister no longer looked at me the same. Family gatherings were filled with awkwardness, stolen glances, and heavy silences, with my Bill always lurking, never quite able to meet my eyes, a specter of guilt hanging between my sister and me like a suffocating fog. The cold truth gnawed at my gut. I had been right to speak up, yet I felt you could also argue I had been wrong for tearing my sister's life apart. Days turned to weeks, and I began to notice the cracks in their marriage, the late nights, the whispered conversations, and my sister's phone buzzing incessantly, her face paling at every ding. She had started to pull away, and I couldn't tell if what I did was protecting her or sealing her doom. One night, I received a frantic call from James. My Bill was in a car accident, the extent of his injuries unknown, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I thought of how everything had unraveled, how the accusation had peeled away layers of our family, each peeled section exposing scars that were better left hidden. My sister arrived at the hospital, her eyes red, her heart clenching in fear and uncertainty, and I felt a pang of remorse twist in my chest. Despite the pain he caused, seeing her like this made me question everything all over again. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the silence spoke volumes. When they wheeled him in, bruised and battered, the sharp sting of regret was almost unbearable as she rushed to his side, whispering sweet nothings that felt like hollow echoes in the sterile room. I turned away, leaving them to their moment of twisted fate, my heart heavy with the weight of choices made under duress. Watching them reconcile, I felt like a voyeur to a world that now had to navigate treachery disguised as love, and in that waiting room, surrounded by facades of support, I realized the true horror of it all. Was I the villain for sharing a secret that should have never been mine to carry, or was I just a wronged sister bearing the burden of truth in a world filled with dark secrets that fester in silence like a malignancy? As I stepped into the dark of the night, the stars seeming to mock me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real horror wasn't just what my Bill said, but what love could endure. I never thought I would end up here, bleeding my emotions onto the screen as I try to make sense of it all and decide if I'm the one in the wrong. Just last week, I fainted in my kitchen, the gritty tile floor rushing to meet me, but the heart of my pain sat just a few feet away in the form of my mother, an unyielding fortress of misunderstanding. It felt like I'd stepped into a twisted reality where my cries for help fell on deaf ears, and all that mattered was her dismissive belief that I was faking it for attention. I had never felt so betrayed. The world had dimmed, and in that instant, I thought I was fading away into an abyss that no one would care to follow me into. My vision blurred, then darkened, but I could feel the roughness of the floor beneath my cheek and hear the low thump of my heart battling against unconsciousness. When the world began to spin back into focus, I struggled to lift my head, and there she was, my mother, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, only interested in making her nightly casserole than in the gaping wound I had in my soul. "You're just pretending to get attention," she said, her voice thick with irritation. I wanted to scream, to tell her the truth, that I had battled anxiety for years, that my heart felt as if it were about to rip through my chest, that I felt truly unreal, like a ghost drifting through the people I loved. But there was no understanding reflected back at me, only the sharpness of her words cutting deeper with every breath I took. For a long moment, we were locked in a silent battle, her convinced that my struggles were merely a performance, while I struggled to prove that my reality was real, that I was standing on the edge of a cliff with the darkest depths beneath me and her scorn pushing me closer to the edge. It was just a few weeks before I had sat across from her at the kitchen table, trying to explain the weight in my chest, how the walls felt as if they were closing in, how I sometimes couldn't breathe, and instead of empathizing, she pointed her fork at me, a jeering light in her eyes, declaring that I had too much time on my hands, that I was just perpetually unhappy. I'd done everything I could to break through to her, gentlemen's letters and gentle nudges that fell flat, like trying to lift an anchor with sheer determination alone. She would ignore the trembling in my hands, the tears that fell silently, the way I'd collapse into numbness after a panic attack, and she'd always find an excuse to blame my moods on anything but what was truly happening inside my head. While I lay there that day, moaning on the floor, I felt resentment transform into rage. I couldn't believe she would act like this in my moment of need, her disdain a heavy anvil shackled to my consciousness as I finally pushed myself off the ground, my eyes meeting hers with a pleading desperation that only fueled her disdain further. "You didn't even bother to check if I was okay," I eventually shouted, the anguish leaking from my voice. "You think I'm just faking? Can't you see I'm in pain?" But she stood her ground, her face a mask of stubbornness and defiance as she retorted, "You're just looking for drama. Stop being so overdramatic." Those words cut deeper than any blade ever could. It was like a reflex, that aching feeling of abandonment, the urge to recoil and hide from someone I longed to trust, but I was trapped in this harsh reality. My stomach twisted in knots as the anger morphed into something darker within me, unforgivable rage mixed with heartbreak as I stared into her cold eyes and thought about all the nights I spent crying in the dark, pleading for someone to understand. It was the moment I realized that I had to fight against the truth that felt carved into my bones, that love can be two-edged, and sometimes, the very people who are supposed to support and understand you are the ones who are too quick to turn away. Time stretched then, laden with heavy silence, until I stumbled towards my bedroom, the weight of her misunderstanding an anchor that dragged behind me. I locked the door and collapsed onto my unkempt bed, letting the frustration seep out with furious sobbing as I thought about how little she truly understood me. It was as if every time I reached for clarity, she was there to snatch it away, and I was left floating in a vast sea of confusion. That night, I clutched my chest and felt every beat like a distant echo. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, praying for some sign, any sign, that my mother could hear me over those hollow corridors that separated us. Every rebuttal echoed in my mind until a sobering realization washed over me. Perhaps she was not just blind to my torment, but maybe it was easier for her to rationalize my struggles as mere theatrics than to confront the truth of my internal battles, the stark reality of mental illness that crawled beneath my skin like a restless spirit. I thought of reaching for my phone, posting about how words can wound more than any physical ailment ever could, but in weighing my pain against the potential backlash, I opted for silence. In the days that followed, a storm brewed in our household, tension-lacing conversations as if each word trembled in the weight of unspoken grief. I was still tender, raw from the contempt I felt from her. I wanted to scream, to write everything I felt in the hopes she would finally cradle my heart in her hands, understand the bitter truth that a child's pleas can echo endlessly into the void. But every time I looked into her eyes, all I saw was the reflection of the disbelief. I often wondered if she'd ever truly recognized the scars hidden under a simple facade. Finally, a week later, another fainting spell struck, harder this time. A great wave of blackness, panic surging within me, the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I hit the floor again, and as my consciousness flickered and danced dangerously close to the edge, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time she would hear me. Maybe she would change. But when I regained composure, I found her at the door, a storm brewing in her eyes. "Not this again." I blinked away the haze of the sudden blackout, but her words felt like chains already binding me down, wretched chains forged from her disbelief. I heard her footsteps retreating down the hall, leaving me once again left to wrestle with demons that had become so familiar in the stillness that followed. Maybe I was faking it all, maybe this was just an elaborate play for attention, and I was the fool who couldn't keep up the act. But as darkness loomed over me, I knew I would rather face my fears alone than be misunderstood by the very person who should have had my back. In those silent moments, I bore the burden of my brokenness, a fragile entity yearning for brightness like a blooming flower desperate for sun, ready to wilt under the weight of unmet needs. I wish I could say that I woke up one day with the answers, that somehow, my mother would grasp the truth locked within my heart and walk beside me as I traveled through this bewildering labyrinth of human emotion. Instead, I began to learn to understand what it meant to be both the lost child and the one seeking the truth untouched by doubt, as I realized that sometimes the greatest battles we fight are not against our illness, but against the shadows cast by those who refuse to meet us in the light. I never thought a simple visit to the grocery store would spiral into my own personal horror story, but that's exactly what happened last Wednesday evening when I encountered a mother and her 8-year-old son, a boy who, at first glance, seemed like your typical kid but quickly revealed an unsettling darkness. I was just trying to pick up a few essentials, milk, bread, you know the drill, when I noticed the boy running wild through the aisles, screaming at the top of his lungs, throwing items on the floor like it was his own personal playground. His mother was oblivious, seemingly texting distractedly on her phone while he sprinted down the cereal aisle, knocking boxes left and right. At first, I thought it was amusing, maybe even a harmless little tantrum, but as I watched him shove a box of Frosted Flakes into another shopper's cart, laughter turned to unease. The slap of cardboard hitting tile echoed in the empty aisle, and I felt the adrenaline kick in as he turned to me with eyes wide and wild, a twisted grin stretching across his face that seemed far too old for a child. I glanced at his mother, expecting her to at least scold him, but she just kept scrolling, her expression blank, as if her son's chaos barely registered. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. I approached her, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I said, my heart racing even as I attempted to remain calm, "I think you might want to keep a closer eye on your son. He's causing quite the mess." To my dismay, she looked up, annoyance flashing in her eyes as if I were the problem. "It's just a little fun," she snapped, rolling her eyes and returning to her phone, dismissing me in a way that sent chills down my spine. That grin from her son widened, and I swear I felt the temperature drop. Left with no choice, I decided to confront the child directly. After all, children respond to authority, right? "Hey buddy," I said, squatting down to his level, forcing myself to meet his gaze, "how about we help your mom and clean this up together?" His laughter echoed eerily in the silence, and then he took a single step back, looking me up and down with a knowing glint in his eye that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "You can't make me," he said, voice low and steady, way too serious for someone his age. I felt a chill race through me, a primal instinct to back off, but I pushed forward. "You'll get in trouble if you don't behave." For a moment, it seemed like my words had cut through the fog, and I could almost see the gears turning in his head. But then he just laughed again, this deep, guttural sound that echoed through the aisle, and I recoiled, suddenly feeling foolish for even trying. Almost as if the darkness inside him had risen to the surface, he spread his arms, as if preparing for flight, letting out a shriek so piercing it felt like it shattered glass. The commotion caught the attention of a nearby employee, who jogged over, eyebrows raised at the chaos unfolding before him, but as he stepped up to intervene, the boy turned and sprinted in the other direction, darting down the aisle and knocking over a display of snack cakes. In his wake, bewildered shoppers merely stared, shifting their bags and exchanging unsure glances. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I had no idea that feeling would soon become a reality. As the mother finally began to gather her son, I felt a tiny flicker of relief. Maybe she would see reason after all. But as she stepped closer, her face contorted in anger, she aimed her ire at me. "What the hell is your problem? He's just a kid." A deathly silence enveloped the aisle, and I could hear a pin drop as the other customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the mother. I could feel my cheeks flush with heat. After all, I was just trying to help. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just a typical grocery store visit anymore, it had turned into something much darker. "He's out of control," I stammered, my voice wavering slightly under the weight of her gaze. "Maybe if you paid attention." But before I could finish my sentence, the boy reappeared behind her, that same twisted grin plastered across his face, but this time, it felt like a veil of malice had descended over the air. "Don't you think she began, but the boy suddenly lunged at me, tackling my legs and causing me to stumble back, the world tilting as I hit the hard floor. My hands instinctively shot out to catch myself, pain sparking up my palms. Glaring up at the ceiling, I caught a glimpse of the kid running toward the entrance, laughter dancing on his lips, echoing in the empty space like a haunting memory. "Get him," I shouted, my voice hoarse as I regained my footing, but my cries were lost in a cacophony of chaos, the mother just standing there in shock, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. It was surreal, feeling powerless as the crowd around us erupted into confusion, and I felt a sick realization washing over me. I had crossed a line, had intervened where I should have simply walked away. With each passing moment, tension thickened the air, and soon, I felt the terror of this bizarre scenario settle deeply in my gut. Crazily enough, it all seemed to happen in slow motion. I dashed after the boy just as he slipped out the glass doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave of clarity, and my heart pounding in my chest as I shouted again, "Stop!" He raced toward the parking lot, the glow of headlights flickering erratically, but just as I was about to reach him, a strange sensation washed over me, some primal instinct screaming to run away. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of his eyes, darker than the night itself, seeming to draw in all the light around him, and I felt my body freeze, paralyzed in fear as if some unseen force was holding me in place. "You can't stop me," he said, the childish lilt of his voice twisted into something unrecognizable, and in that moment, I could swear I saw a flicker of malice, no, a flicker of something far worse, deep within him that confirmed my worst fears. This child was not just out of control, there was something inherently wrong with him. Every instinct screamed for me to turn and flee, to escape the darkness that threatened to engulf me, but I was rooted, lost in those eyes that shone with an ancient malevolence, an echo of something that should never belong in a child. I felt the wind whispering warnings to me, but the moment I finally turned to run, I felt a sharp pain straining through my back. Looking down in disbelief, I realized that the boy, I don't even know how, was suddenly upon me, and he had stuck a butcher knife into my side, the world swiftly fading into a crimson haze as pain engulfed my senses. Everything became muffled and distant, the screams, the sirens, the horrified gasps of passers-by became a bizarre symphony, swelling as I crumpled to the ground, the cool concrete cradling me as I gasped for breath, caught in an inescapable nightmare. As I lay there, eyes flickering shut against an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole, I could hear the mother call out to him, "David, come back." But her voice sounded far away, as if it belonged to another world. In my fading moments, my mind was a whirlpool of regrets, of could-haves and should-haves, realizing too late that when the line between innocence and darkness blurs, it is often the innocent who pay the ultimate price. All I started with was a simple commentary on parenting, and now I was just another casualty in a tale nobody would believe. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, "We can do it next week." Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me, anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, "He wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him." With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. "I just wanted him to have fun," he muttered, eyes cast downward. "I didn't mean to hurt you." I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. "What's going on?" Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pain of desperation as I fought to find the right words. "Mark, you're losing us." The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference. I never thought attending my aunt's baby shower would lead to the kind of nightmare I could barely comprehend, but looking back, the entire day felt like a slow-motion train wreck that I could do nothing to stop. The moment I stepped into her lavishly decorated living room, filled with pastel-colored balloons and annoyingly cute decorations, a sense of dread washed over me. My aunt, who had always been the fun relative, was now the center of attention for her impending motherhood, and I was just a reluctant guest somewhat dragged into it by family obligations. As we congregated in a circle, playing those absurd games no one genuinely enjoyed, I felt the weight of the pressure to put on a smile, pretend I cared, and above all, be respectful, even though I knew I had no intention of doing so. You see, I had secretly vowed not to attend if the invitation didn't specifically ask for me. In essence, it was a pity invite, and I wasn't about to humor her for the sake of appearances. She could hardly keep her enthusiasm in check as she opened gifts, which only added fuel to my frustration. As she unwrapped yet another onesie garnished with cartoon elephants, the urge to unleash my disdain boiled inside me, colliding with the social facade I was trying to uphold. That's when my cousin's judgmental gaze caught mine. It was one of those looks that said, "Are you really going to spoil this?" And in that moment, I snapped. Without thinking, I blurted, "You should have picked a different theme, Aunt Linda, this one just screams desperately trying to cope with reality." The room fell silent. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the awkward shifting of chairs. Aunt Linda's smile faltered, her hands froze midair, cradling a pastel gift bag. What I now realized was a colossal faux pas on my part that I could never take back. I thought I might hear laughter, perhaps even a sarcastic comment to lighten the mood, but it was only my heart pounding in my ears as embarrassment washed over her and me in equal measure. She tried to laugh it off, a strange sound that only added to the tension, but the damage was done. Cousins exchanged glances, probably wondering what kind of monster they had in their family. As the clock ticked by, so did my humiliation, morphing into something darker. I could sense my aunt's dwindling excitement, like a balloon slowly deflating, and suddenly the quaint surroundings felt sinister, as if the pastel decorations were laughing at me. The whispers began, not just about my comment but about my intentions. I was somehow branded the villain of the day, the one who could not tolerate the simple joy of family. And then, the lights flickered, subtle at first, like a knowing wink, but with each passing moment, they gradually dimmed further until it felt like the room had shifted entirely. I could hear the sound of muffled conversations echoing around the walls, each echoed word dripping with disdain towards me even as more presents were opened, but what really unnerved me was the realization that with each present emptied of its novelty, my aunt seemed to grow smaller, lost beneath the heaps of expectation. As cupcakes were served, I could taste the bitterness of my own words lingering on my tongue, and the silence thickened as if we were all trapped in a bubble too surreal to puncture. Unable to bear the atmosphere any longer, I left the room, mumbling something about needing water, but what I found was unexpectedly horrifying. The hallway was dark, and my own shadow felt cloaked in a fog, twisting in ways that threatened to swallow me whole. Glancing back, I caught sight of Aunt Linda, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, a chilling stillness radiating from her. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift behind her, something not quite right, a swirling darkness that lurked at the edges of the light, whispering secrets I dared not grasp. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move as curiosity and fear wrestled within me. Just as I mustered the courage to step closer, the air thickened around me, and I heard a faint melody, almost like a lullaby, that filled the space with weight and melancholy. The kind of song that might soothe an infant while sending shivers up the spines of grown adults. And then in that eerie calm, Aunt Linda turned, and I swear I saw something flicker across her face, a shadow of anger or perhaps disappointment so profound that I understood, in that moment, it was something far deeper than the trivial squabble we just had. I would later wish I had turned back when the last guest left, because the darkness that followed me into the living room wasn't just an absence of light, it enveloped me in a fear I couldn't fully articulate. I could barely follow the stifled conversation as my relatives buzzed about gifts and game scores. A soft sob reached my ears from where Aunt Linda stood, and in that instant of realization, I understood that the baby shower was not merely a celebration, but a last-ditch effort for her sanity amidst the growing anticipation, the kind that had swallowed her long before I opened my mouth. When I finally returned home, exhausted and filled with regret, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in Aunt Linda's house had wrapped around her like a stalker, that they were now straining to break free, dragging her down into a world that would never be the same again. And soon, I had to face the truth. Sometimes, an unfiltered moment of honesty could unravel something fragile, something unwanted, leaving me wondering just how far I had crossed the line of being the family embarrassment, and if I might have awakened something darker within her that no one else would have to confront but me. Days passed into weeks, and every time my phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Linda, I hesitated, knowing that the silence between us had morphed into a chasm too wide to bridge. I'd come to realize that perhaps my failure to exhibit tact was not purely about a single moment, but about something profound. Her descent after the shower had spiraled into a silence filled with shadows that felt tragically suffocating. And while I should have reached out with an apology, I remained sequestered in my own turmoil, fearing that each unreturned message was a dagger aimed at the heart of my conscience, pushing me deeper into the abyss of guilt. Little did I know that guilt would soon transform into dread as vague whispers tainted the air around me, and the creeping sense that I had not just embarrassed my aunt but set something free snaked through the cracks of my reality like a shattering dreamscape. And in that unsettling blend of right and wrong, I found myself asking the haunting question that wouldn't let me go. Was I really the villain in this story, or had I merely opened a door that should have remained shut? I always thought the worst pain I could feel was when I found out my parents were getting divorced, but that feeling shifted like quicksand the night my little sister, Lily, came to me with tear-stained cheeks, her voice trembling as she confessed that she had gotten her first period. She was just 11, and the innocence of her childhood streaked through her eyes, now clouded with embarrassment and confusion. I had been bracing myself for a long time, what with the endless conversations overheard at school and the so-called talk my mother gave me 2 years prior, but nothing could prepare me for the look on Lily's face, that mixture of fear and a burgeoning understanding of the chaos that awaited her. I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to recall the advice I had read online, about being supportive, about nurturing that bond since we relied on each other like life buoys in an unforgiving sea, even more so now that our parents were consumed by their own turmoil and neglecting us, both lost in their separations. I pulled her into my arms, and as she sobbed quietly against me, I was instantly pulled into a pit where the emotions swirled like a dark tornado, and in that moment I knew I had to step up, to protect her from the harshness of reality. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper and a pad from the bathroom, mind racing, recalling our mom's half-hearted attempts to prepare Lily for this moment. I quickly returned to her, guiding her through the basics, but in doing so, I stumbled upon an unsettling reality hidden in the folds of my sister's innocence. She revealed, hesitantly, that the other girls in school mocked her for being late and starting her period, whispered cruel jokes about how unsophisticated she was while hinting at something I feared she'd overheard about girls turning into women. I assured her it was normal, that our bodies had a way of doing things at their own pace, but as I said it, guilt gnawed at my insides, eating away at my conscience. How could I comfort her when I knew that what lay ahead would likely be filled with heartache, loneliness, and fear? We sat there on the edge of her bed, the quiet of night wrapping around us like a cold blanket, and with every wave of her breath against my shoulder, I felt the enormity of her vulnerability resting heavily on me. I tasked myself with being her protector in a world that often felt far too dark and unforgiving. I promised her that she wouldn't have to go through this alone, that I would always be there. Little did I know, those words would lead us down a path none of us were prepared for. The next day, Lily seemed different, almost more mature, as if a weight had somehow settled into her. I didn't take long before I began to feel something changing within myself, too, like some awful mirroring effect was taking place. In my quest to become her shield, I found myself swallowed by her emotional storm, helplessly caught in the eye where everything around us felt disorienting. I began to notice things. She developed new friends, appeared distant, but the worst part was the way I sensed something festering beneath her surface, like an unfathomable darkness or perhaps that deep sorrow that lingered behind her eyes. I wanted to speak to her, to coax out the shadows that now seemed to dance around her, but every time I did, she would brush me off with an insistent wave of her hand. One night, fueled by concern, I crept into her room after our parents had gone to bed. She was still awake, buried under the glow of her cell phone, and I plopped down next to her. I didn't even need to ask when she shifted, revealing a chat filled with messages that were thrusting her further into a world I didn't understand, middle school dramas, hints of early romances, and then, hammering home the point, someone had sent her a picture that left me cold. It was explicit, shocking, and everything a part of me wanted to shield her from. I felt furious. No, it was rage boiling underneath. How could anyone do that to someone so young? Without thinking twice, I confronted her gently, asking who was sending these things, our conversation turning sharp and painful as I realized she hadn't grasped the true weight of what she was dealing with. In that moment, too many emotions washed over me, but most of all was a feeling of isolation. I couldn't figure out how to help her, how to explain the monsters that lurked in the shadows without utterly breaking her spirit. Days turned into weeks, marked by evenings spent tiptoeing around her feelings while leaving me in the dark as she continued to withdraw. The minute she slipped out of my sight, it felt like I watched her die a little more every day, unraveling from love and into something that, well, what? I started to piece things together, realizing she began skipping classes, never mentioning who she was with, and then one day, she didn't come home at all. My heart crashed and burned in swirls of chaos as I called her friends, her school, my hands trembling in utter panic. Each second she remained away felt like ice carving into my veins until finally, as dusk set in, she sauntered through the door, seemingly unfazed by the hours spent being lost. As I bolted to her side, I searched her downcast eyes for answers, feeling that primal instinct to protect her surge one last time. When I asked where she was, she bristled, snapped back like a taut string before slipping into silence. I grabbed her arm, desperation creeping under my skin, and that was when things took a twisted turn. I felt fire ignite within her gaze, a fierce rebellion that she was beginning to nurture, and in the split second I had touched her, something deep inside flickered. I didn't expect her to lash out, her entire being springing into life, demanding that I back off. In that moment, I knew I had gone too far, that I had unintentionally shoved her closer to the edge. I hadn't voiced the words that were screaming in my mind. I was afraid that forcing her to reveal herself would only make her run further into that abyss. A part of me didn't want her to feel like I was another adult trying to control her. I had hoped to be her ally, her refuge, but she stomped upstairs, slamming the door in my face, and my heart shattered. For the next few days, I treaded carefully around the house, tiptoeing as if walking on shards of glass, instinctively holding my breath each time I heard her room creak. Then, another vision of anger flashed unveiled. I could feel my heart thundering as I heard muffled laughter from her direction, friends gathering outside to tease, and I saw them, those girls I had never approved of before. Who were they? I wanted to know why they were allowed to drag her into their world when it seemed to drip with deceit. I was about to barge out there, to pull her back, but suddenly I stopped. I felt this cold wave of clarity, recognizing that if I did invade her space, my little sister may very well tumble into an abyss far darker than what I had imagined. Instead, I chose silence, wrestling with the demons of self-doubt feeling heavy on my shoulders. Days blurred into months like an out-of-focus movie reel, and soon, my worst fears became reality. I found myself sitting across from a counselor, poring over the underlying pains that now accompanied our family, the way it twisted into this labyrinth of hurt, questioning where I had failed in being a sibling, and somewhere along the lines, I realized I had handed her over to those shadows, letting those dark forces seep through like poison into her very core. The last few weeks since we had that fight left me shattered. Late-night phone calls from parents screaming over the phone made everything tragic, like a play for a performance nobody wanted to witness. I felt the sting each time I saw her retreat into the darkness, feeling helpless behind my own walls, and knowing I would likely remain in the background while she began to spiral down that path without me. What hurt most was the knowledge that, while I had desperately tried to be her savior, I had ultimately failed in one crucial aspect. I didn't truly understand that stepping up meant giving her the space to figure out her identity without my controlling shadow looming over. The question haunted me, echoing incessantly, was I truly right or utterly selfish in wanting to drag her back from that darkness? What I had to learn, and what I hoped she could too, was that the road toward each other may be laden with shadows, but if she were in the darkness, I would be waiting for her beacon light, hoping she wasn't too far from remembering how to shine. I didn't expect my life to twist into this nightmare the day my husband brought his daughter from his first marriage to live with us. She was only 10, and he thought that having her here would help mend the fractured relationship they had, but, honestly, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Sure, I cared about her, she was a kid, after all, but I wasn't ready to be a parental figure, especially not so soon after we got married, and I made that clear to him, only for him to dismiss my discomfort with comments about being a real family. The first week was a whirlwind of chaos. She arrived with a duffel bag full of clothes but left the rest of her emotional baggage in her soul, the kind nobody else sees until it starts to weigh heavy in the air between us. Her name was Lily, and her big, doe-like eyes always seemed to hold memories of something dark, something unspoken. I sometimes caught her staring out of the window, as if waiting for someone or something that would never come, even as she wore a forced smile. The problem wasn't just her sadness, it was the creeping sense of menace that seemed to follow her, like something from a horror movie. There were strange occurrences, like objects moving on their own, or the times we'd hear soft sobbing at night, which would just be her mumbling in her sleep, but it made me feel paranoid every time I had to check on her. What made things worse was the way my husband looked at her, the way his eyes softened. It made me feel as if I was slowly exiting the picture, replaced by a ghost of his past. One night, while I was supposed to be preparing dinner, I heard her whispering to what I thought was an empty room, and when I walked in, she paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty old book that had mysteriously appeared on the floor. I asked her about it, but her answer made my skin crawl. She said, "It's from my friend," which chilled me to the bone. I brushed it off, but the sense of dread grew with each strange event. The pictures on the wall started to tilt during the night, and whispers would echo in the hallways, trapped in the silence like trapped souls. I found myself constantly wondering if I was losing it, yet every time my husband and I fought, she'd seem to smirk as if she was the one pulling the strings in our marital discord. It escalated when I was packing for a weekend trip, and I found my necklaces strewn across the floor, hung like strange trophies on a noose made of what I could only assume was her sick humor. That night, I had a nightmare, a vision of a shadowy figure lurking behind her, its fingers stretched toward me. I jolted awake to find Lily standing at the end of my bed, her face illuminated by the moon. She simply smiled at me, tilting her head like a dog who hears a distant sound, which sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I screamed, waking my husband, who dismissed my fears as a mom's unfortunate imagination running wild, even when I showed him the book she claimed was from her friend. He read it and laughed, calling it a children's story, but the illustrations alone filled my stomach with dread. It was all about a little girl who made a pact with something ominous, something that came to collect its debts in twisted forms. I kept my confrontations about Lily's behaviors and the odd happenings to myself. After all, I was the one deemed the villain, labeled the stepmother who wouldn't embrace this child. The final straw came when Lily began talking about her friend more frequently. "He's coming to visit," she'd say with a serene smile, her eyes gleaming like the reflection of the moon in water. I thought I could reason with my husband, but he was too enthralled by her presence, a father blinded by the chance to rewrite their sad history. Then one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't like you," is all I could catch, and then my husband's laughter, the sound grating against my instincts. I felt invisible, like a specter lingering in an abandoned house, and everything culminated when I returned home one day to find the house eerily silent. My husband was gone, and so was Lily. Panic gripped my chest like a vice as my calls echoed in the empty halls. The air thickened with uncertainty. Suddenly, the front door swung open. It was my husband, disheveled but alive, and behind him, with a faint glow, was Lily, holding a crude, dark drawing that depicted me, lifeless, under ominous clouds. My heart sank as I noticed her smile was replaced with a sinister, knowing grin as she said, "I told you he'd come back for you." That night, I sat trembling in bed, too terrified to sleep, the drawing propped open in full view, wishing with all my heart that this nightmare was just a figment of my overactive imagination. The atmosphere swirled with tension and malice, and each time I turned over in bed, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting to collect something that had been promised long before I came into the picture. When dawn broke, the reality of my situation struck me, and for the first time, I wondered if I was making a mistake by refusing to take responsibility for the child who seemed to pull our family apart, knowing all too well that ghosts aren't always literal. Sometimes they are very, very real, and I had become the woman caught in the suffocating grip of a sinister pact, wondering if I, too, would be forgotten like the countless characters in the tales that had begun to seep into my mind, hoping desperately I wouldn't become a warning for someone else in the dark. It was just supposed to be a casual night in with my friends, sitting on the couch while we binge-watched old horror movies and made jokes about the cheesy effects, but everything shifted when Lynn, my closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin and said, "You know, watching you two is like watching a really intricate roleplay," and for a split second, I started laughing, not because I thought it was true, who would seriously think that? But more because the idea struck me as absurd, like something ripped from the pages of a bad fanfiction. My boyfriend, Jake, chuckled too, more out of awkwardness than agreement, but when I looked at Lynn, her expression changed from playful to something darker, almost predator-like, and in that moment, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as one of her quirky comments at first, but the laughter died in the air, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't realize it then, but my laugh had unearthed something buried deep within the group, like invoking a slumbering spirit at a seance. The night progressed, filled with laughter over bad jump scares and popcorn fights, but every so often, I'd catch Lynn staring at me through the flickering light of the TV, her gaze intense, almost conspiratorial. As the clock struck midnight, the final film ended, leaving echoes of creepy music lingering in the air, and we all decided to call it a night. I started cleaning up the mess, tossing empty snack bags into the trash while Jake and Lynn chatted in the corner, and I could tell something was off. Lynn's smile had morphed into a smirk, and I felt that familiar unease prick at my skin, a sense I couldn't quite shake. Later, as Jake and I were getting ready for bed, I joked about Lynn's comment, playfully nudging him, "Maybe we should, spice things up a bit?" But he didn't laugh. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing. "What did you mean by that?" he asked, and I felt a rush of confusion. Wasn't we on the same page? I told him I was kidding, but then he shifted closer, scanning my face. "You didn't take her seriously, did you?" The weight of his gaze pierced through me, and a strange dread curled in the pit of my stomach as I denied it, even as I recalled the glint in Lynn's eyes. The next day, Lynn's texts were as animated as always, but beneath the surface, I could sense something off, like frayed wires on a live circuit. When I met up with her later, I tried to broach the subject lightly, but she dismissed my concern, her laughter ringing too loud, too haunting. The following months became a looping nightmare, where I'd catch Lynn watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, each encounter steeped in an unsettling tension I couldn't comprehend. I'd hear whispers behind my back, hushed tones between Jake and Lynn whenever I left the room, and Jake had begun to change too, his jovial demeanor shadowed by an underlying paranoia that echoed my own. Our intimate conversations grew strained, and he started to echo my own worries back at me. Was Lynn really just a friend, or had I become a pawn in their twisted game? The realization that Lynn had crossed a boundary I didn't fully grasp gripped me like a vice, and unease morphed into outright dread as I pieced together that her ramblings about roleplay might not have been innocent at all. One fateful night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided I had to confront Lynn. I needed to know what was going on behind her mask of friendship. I invited her over, pretending to keep the atmosphere light, yet when she arrived, I could feel the storm brewing beneath our pleasantries, her laughter shrill and forced as I coiled my fists against my trembling legs. "What did you really mean when you said we were role-playing?" I pressed, and her expression flipped from playful to predatory, the corners of her mouth curling into that tight-lipped smile I'd come to dread. "Oh honey," she said, her voice sickly sweet, "you're the one playing a part, but the script was never given to you. You're just too naive to see it." My heart raced as I felt the air grow thick with something so palpable, it bordered on tangible. Every warning bell I had ignored screamed in my head, and I tried to excuse myself, to reclaim my sanity, but as I turned to the door, I could hear her murmuring my name, each syllable laced with something darker. The following week twisted into a surreal nightmare. I started to see shadows cast from my past interactions with both women seep through the cracks of my whitewashed reality, memories warped and rewritten. I catch Jake staring blanks at his phone, brow furrowed, whispers weaving like spider silk between Lynn's oddly timed texts and his own responses, and the intimacy we had shared dwindled to cold, vacant exchanges. I tried talking to him about it, about how Lynn was siphoning energy between us like we were puppets strung along by her whims, but each time, he'd grow defensive, lashing out as if my concerns were unfounded, and I found myself backed into a corner, racked with doubt, as if I was losing both my boyfriend and my own sense of reality. On a particularly agonizing night, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep, plagued by eerie dreams where I was an actor trapped in a puppet show, a caged bird pecked at by invisible threads pulling me into darker depths. I awoke with a start, and for a fleeting moment, the haze of the dream lingered, and I felt compelled to check my messages. The screen glowed eerie in the dark, and as I scrolled through the texts, dread coiled like a serpent around my heart when I discovered an unexpected text from Jake, "Meet me at the old playground," and the timestamp sent a shiver down my spine. It was sent during the night while I'd been dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest as questions overwhelmed me. Had they been plotting against me? What role had I been cast in? I grabbed my keys, driven by an impulse that propelled me forward, the shadows closing in like a muffled silence. The playground loomed in the distance, cloaked in darkness, and each step felt heavy, weighed down by foreboding whispers. As I arrived, the air turned thick and clammy, veiled in a chilling mist that whispered my name. "Jake." I called, but the night swallowed my voice whole. I turned, searching every silhouette under the moonlight, and then I saw her, Lynn, standing there, and in a heartbeat, I froze, terror gripping my throat as I felt an icy blast of realization. It wasn't Jake waiting for me, it was her, and the glint in her eyes confirmed the role I had unknowingly stepped into was far from innocent. "You finally made it," she said, her voice a twisted serenade that shattered my resolve. "I've been waiting for you." The darkness enveloped me, and I was left suspended in a nightmarish tableau, understanding too late that the laughter I once shared had been merely the haunting echo of a sinister game I never wished to play. I'm writing this because I'm overwhelmed and terrified, and honestly, I don't know who to turn to because the whole thing feels surreal, like something out of a nightmare, and if I don't get it out there, I feel like I might explode. It started when I got engaged to my longtime boyfriend, Mike, and decided to have a small wedding in the woods near our favorite hike, nature-themed, simple, and intimate with just a handful of close friends and family for a lovely, rustic gathering. We were excited about everything, but when it came to the cake, we decided to go vegan since my best friend, Kylie, is vegan and had been there for me through thick and thin. We wanted everyone to enjoy it equally, without feeling pressured, and there's this small bakery that makes the most decadent vegan cakes, chocolate with raspberry filling, my absolute favorite. They assured me that the texture was just as rich as a traditional cake, and honestly, I was all in, so I ordered it and kept the choice a secret, wanting to surprise everyone. The day of the wedding arrived, and the air was crisp, filled with the sweet aroma of pine and flowers. The sound of laughter and soft music floated in the breeze as we exchanged our vows, surrounded by the natural beauty that had brought us together. The cake was everything I hoped it would be, a centerpiece topped with wildflowers, and everyone marveled at it when it was revealed, but as soon as someone took a bite, an odd heaviness fell over the gathering. The look on Uncle Barry's face was a mix of confusion and horror as he wiped remnants of cake from his mouth. A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and before I knew it, Kylie was storming up to me with a scowl that could peel paint. Apparently, during her speech about happiness and acceptance, she inadvertently revealed the cake's vegan nature, which catapulted the guests into what felt like a modern-day witch trial. Barry, arms flailing, demanding to know why I had tricked him into eating something I hadn't labeled properly. It all spiraled out of control. Suddenly, guests were accusing me, some saying they felt disrespected by the deception, while others stood up for me, defending the choice and emphasizing taste over labels. I felt trapped in the eye of a storm, where accusations and judgments collided like thunder. I tried to explain my intentions, how I wanted to bring everyone together, but the more I spoke, the angrier they became, some claiming that it's unethical not to make dietary choices clear, which I didn't think was fair when at every event, there's bound to be someone who doesn't agree with the choices made. The tension was suffocating, and soon, guests began to leave one by one. I could see the disappointment written on my mother's face. She'd put everything into making this day special, but all I felt was shame invading my mind. I desperately sought out Mike, who was trying to calm Barry down in a corner, their voices rising with each heated word. Finally, unable to hold back anymore, I turned to Barry and said I was sorry but that he was being dramatic. That apparently triggered the lid off a boiling pot. Somehow, the conversation shifted, and not only was I under fire for the cake, but the whole wedding became a mess that solely fell on my shoulders, with even my mom chiming in with her disappointment. People began packing up the gifts, and I couldn't even process what was happening. Instead, I felt trapped in an absolute nightmare, and I began to weep while holding the remains of the cake, its beauty now marred by a strange mix of frosting and guilt. I lost track of time as people slipped away into the waning light, their murmured judgments still echoing in my head, and I could scarcely absorb the fact that my wedding day had transformed into a circus of accusations over a slice of cake. I caught snippets of conversations as the last of the guests trickled out, and someone even suggested that I should have known better than to force a cake with false marketing on them. I truly hadn't meant to upset anyone. How could a cake embody so much hostility? That night, Mike and I headed back home, his mood reflecting the dimness in my heart. He offered me a half-hearted consolation, mentioning how everyone was being overly dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow ruined our biggest day over something that should have brought joy. Scrolling mindlessly through my phone later, I stumbled upon posts on social media clarifying their positions on veganism as if it were a debate about morality. It tore at my heart when I discovered pictures of my wedding cake, captioned with anger, disillusion, and disbelief from guests recounting the horror of being tricked. That night, I had dreams of each guest's scornful face as they took their first bite, transformed into grotesque figures, shouting that I had robbed them of their right to true desserts. I woke up drenched in sweat, barely able to stomach breakfast, each glance in the mirror reminding me of the shame that lingered so heavy on my conscience. It's been weeks since the wedding, and things slowly returned to normal, but I haven't spoken to Kylie since. She messaged me once to say she felt embarrassed, but I didn't respond, the disappointment in her voice too much for my heart to bear. From my peripheral, I've sensed Barry lurking online, recounting the wedding misstep in forums, initiating dialogues about what it means to purposefully hide vegan options, while I sit here haunted by memories of a beautiful day turned sour over a cake. I wondered if it was worth it to stand up for my decision or if they were right, and the guilt eats me alive. So, am I the asshole for refusing to label my wedding cake as vegan? I just wanted to create a joyful memory, and instead, it feels like I've broken an invisible contract of trust over something intended to be delicious and inclusive, and I can't shake the horrible feeling that whatever small sliver of pride I had in my choice has suddenly turned into something heavy, dark, and deeply harmful. I never considered myself an overly dramatic person, but the night I sent that text to Claire felt like something snapped inside me. It wasn't just a day of frustration but the culmination of months watching my supposed best friend slip away into her endless cycle of busy with no space for the people who actually cared about her. The backstory was simple. Claire had always been the life of the party, the friend who could charm anyone into laughing, but as soon as she landed that promotion, everything changed. Texts went unanswered for days, outings were forgotten or rescheduled, and each time I reached out, her excuse felt more like an avalanche burying us further apart rather than a mountain we could climb together. After what seemed like a final straw, I shot her a message that echoed with my resentment. AITA for telling my friend she can get back in touch when she stops being perpetually busy? I put my phone down and immediately regretted my harsh words, yet part of me felt vindicated, a sense that finally, I'd said what I'd been too scared to articulate for so long. Claire's response wasn't immediate. Instead, there was a deafening silence that made me revisit all those memories we had, the laughter, the late-night talks, the promises of sticking together no matter what. Slowly, dread crept in, replaced by guilt, as I started to wonder if I'd really lost her for good. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day my initial fury waned into a dull ache of longing, until one night, I was awoken from a fitful sleep by a sudden vibration from my phone, my heart racing as I saw Claire's name on the screen. But when I opened her message, dread fueled the rush of blood to my face. She was apologizing, but not like I hoped. Claire hinted at her busy life but there was something heavier, almost ominous in the words. "You don't understand," she wrote, followed by a string of excuses that could have been relatable if not for that unshakable feeling clawing at my mind, a chill that whispered that it was more than just a busy schedule. Ignoring the pull in my gut, I pushed back. I told her to stop the excuses and pushed her for the truth about what had really changed. A bad idea, I guess. I should have let it go, let her come back when she was able to face me again instead of poking through her life like a curious child, because that only escalated the tension between us. In my next message, I asked pointedly, "What does busy really mean for you?" And with that second text sent, it felt like a match struck in a dark room. Her silence morphed into something heavier than I could have anticipated. Suddenly, weeks became a winding path of vague acknowledgments and exchanges tinged with tension until she finally agreed to meet. When we did meet, she looked different, like an entire universe had passed between us. Her eyes were shadowed, cheeks sunken, and her words trembled with a weight I couldn't comprehend. As we sat in the dimly lit cafe, every small talk fell flat. All I could think of was that the light in her had dimmed, almost as if all the joy I knew was trapped somewhere in her busy life, so I desperately grasped for answers, and when I asked her point blank what had really happened, her fingers went still, the air thickened, and her eyes darted around before whispering a confession that sent ice through my veins. "It's not just my job," she said, her voice trembling. "You're not the only one feeling left behind," and when she took a deep breath, I held back tears, bracing for a horror that her words carried, a revelation of how deeply the busy facade had become a shield for something darker. She spoke of a man she didn't know anymore, of late-night calls that turned sinister, and friends whose busy lives were mere distractions from deeper problems, of her struggles and the friends replaced by shadows, until the connection hit harder than a punch. I was losing her, slipping away into a world I couldn't reach. Before I could respond, Claire's face drained of color, and she shot a glance toward the door. Chilled by the sudden urgency in her eyes, I turned just in time to see a figure in the distance, standing just beyond the threshold of the cafe, a silhouette with a familiar air that sent chills down my spine. I tried to ignore the rising panic, but Claire's reaction was telling. She jumped to her feet, gripping my arm. "We have to go, now," she urged, and the desperation in her voice sent my heart racing. We bolted out into the streets, and as her shaky hands held the door open, I felt that something was hunting us, a relentless specter lurking in the shadows of our conversations, waiting to pull Claire back into whatever darkness stalked her. We spent the next few hours zigzagging through back alleys, weaving in and out of shops until finally, we collapsed into a cramped diner, both gasping for breath. As we sat there, the weight of unspoken secrets loomed over us like a storm, and while I tried desperately to convince her to share the stories that gnawed at her, the look in her eyes told me more than words could. She was scared, not just of whatever hunted her, but of revealing the truth that had been clawing at her for so long. It was in that moment I realized the gravity of my message. This busy life of hers was more than just a job, it was a barrier, a desperate attempt to keep the shadows at bay. I made a silent promise to myself, a promise to break through the fear that bound her even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. But the night didn't end there, and right as we decided to head out, wrapped in our resolve, there it was again, the distant hum of bad energy, a sense of ice stalking us just out of sight. Our instincts kicked in, fears bubbling to the surface, culminating in an unspoken understanding that, whatever passed between us was not finished. And as we ducked and weaved through the darkness, I felt the familiar weight of haunting echoes, every unanswered message, every ignored call, every vicious cycle, it all came crashing down. Claire had been drowning this entire time, and I had been blind.